distinguished panelists, faculty members, students, and our dear guests. Thank you all for joining us for what promises to be a very stimulating discussion on the freedom of speech and censorship. We appreciate the trouble all of you have taken. Some of you have traveled long distances. All of us understand the time that it takes to reach the university, and we're very happy that all of you have joined us for this discussion. Let me begin by also commending the organizers for putting together such a thoughtful concept note. I think they have possibly looked at all aspects that we could discuss here, and there aren't any specific questions that we're focusing on. So right from what we understand as the foundations for the freedom of speech, that is the need for political speech, to questions of what we understand as restrictions by non-state actors, which is nowadays proving to be one of the most difficult challenges for legal systems as well. We've developed systems to talk about the state and hold the state responsible irrespective of how well they work or they don't work, but at least we have a mechanism. But what is increasingly being seen is that free speech is not only being restricted in terms of the state alone, but also by non-state actors. And how do we then define the contours of freedom of speech, and whether hate speech would really constitute speech at all? Would it be protected speech? So from one particular understanding of speech, I think the concept note is wide enough to include all of these various concerns which talk about individual freedoms. But I thought I would like to put a couple of issues on the table, and any of the speakers could pick them up, and students can, and the audience can also pick it up as well. One of the concerns which is implicit, but we could actually flag out, is the question of remedies in terms of non-state actors, one. And the concern becomes even more when we're looking at the new forms that the freedom of speech is occupying, that is social media. Now, while social media offers a possibility of reaching out to audiences which did not exist before, it also contains with it the challenge of the restrictions or the response to speech that we're having to deal with. So whether you want to talk about trolling, or I would actually virtually say in some cases it amounts to witch hunting, we simply don't have the responses to deal with these. So while technology is offering us new avenues, it is also opening up the space for a kind of backlash which is almost unprecedented. So whether one wants to look at the Perumal Murugan case in India, or one wants to look at the attacks on bloggers in Bangladesh, this is not just in terms of state action that we are concerned with, but we're also very concerned with those who are not state, but who seem to have almost the same, if not more power than the state has in terms of control and restrictions on speech. And this raises the question of whether hate speech does really constitute speech or not. Although this is an old debate, I think it has been given new meaning by persons writing from the margins who talk about the impact that hate speech has on not just speech but on political participation. So if we are simply talking about the chilling effect in terms of state, then how do we account for the impact that the capture of particular media or the use of the electronic media for certain purposes, what is literally amounting to a manipulation of public opinion, if not the manufacturing of public opinion? How does one actually talk about the freedom of speech in this context? So the concept note covers all of these, and I'm sure the speakers will be responding to them. We also have a very distinguished panel, and all of them would be responding to these and other concerns. Let me begin by introducing our speakers. We have Mr. Gautam Navlakha. All of us again know of the work that he has done in terms of not just democratic rights in general, but specifically on Kashmir. The consistent efforts taken to restore some kind of dialogue, some kind of normalcy in this issue, in this area, has been his life work. And he would be speaking to us on questions regarding the control of media and the unprecedented response that we have seen of the print media, where they've decided to black out their own news in response to government censorship. We also have Mr. Kingchuk Nag, again a person who is at the forefront of journalism, who has spent many years, and his books have given us insight into so many issues of public concern. We would like him to speak on the choices that journalists in the print media have to face these days, and how does one actually balance out opinions, how does one balance out the various influences on them. We would be delighted to hear from him on this. We have Mr. Siddharth Varadarajan, again a very well-known voice and a very respected journalist for his thoughtful and incisive comments on a range of issues, a celebrated journalist. And we would hope that he would also talk to us about the emerging challenges that the print media and the electronic media both face at very different levels. We have with us Ms. Deepta Rao, who will be providing us with the legal perspective and the need for the law on free speech to evolve to meet new challenges is something that we look forward to hearing from her. So without taking too much time, may I invite the first speaker, Mr. Siddharth Varadarajan, to address the gathering. Thank you again.
I received an email this morning about a story which is dividing the media profession like none that we've seen in recent weeks or months, which has to do with the call that the editor-in-chief of the Times Now channel, Arnab Goswami, made on air, where he questioned the patriotism and the credentials of other journalists and editors, and essentially called for the government to take action against these unnamed people. And I received a question from a journalist who's doing a story on this, where she said that the quote below is from Goswami's show, and this is the quote: "I say not bringing them to trial compromises my country further, the people who are pro-Pakistan. And I don't care if some of these people are in the media, bring them to trial too." And the question that was put to me was, as one of India's editors, what do you think about one journalist calling upon other journalists to be tried because of the views they hold? And to my mind, this problem and this question really goes to the heart of everything that is sick and wrong with not just the state of the Indian media, but the nature and quality of the public sphere in India, the nature and quality of political and public debate that we have. And I don't need to tell you, lawyers, that the fundamental premise of the question put to me, which is of course the fundamental premise of Mr. Goswami's rant, rests on basic ignorance of the law. Because to think that the country that you swear by and whose laws you respect and whose constitution you pay obeisance to and in whose defense you want to prosecute everybody and anybody, to believe that the constitution and the law of this country criminalizes somebody having a view or belief is to betray complete and utter ignorance of the law. It's no surprise that these are the same editors, these are the same channels that tied themselves up in knots over the controversy in JNU earlier this year. The Kanhaiya Kumar episode, where attempts were made to invoke the law. newspaper that you can or cannot print X, Y, Z, and if you do, you do so at the pain of criminal action. Does the absence of formal legal censorship mean that the media is free? I would say not really. Because there are all kinds of restrictions which come into play, which affect what a journalist can write and report on, which affect decisions that editors take that concern proprietors. So the arena is circumscribed, and it would be foolish to pretend otherwise. But insofar as there aren't legal pre-censorship laws, I suppose we need to be grateful for small mercies. That said, I want to spend the time that I have, 5 or 6 minutes that are left, on the nature of the restrictions which we do confront, which we as journalists and editors deal with, and which affect you as members of the public, because they do limit and circumscribe your right to know, your right to be informed, your right to information, your right to be able to take well-informed decisions on the basis of complete information. And I would broadly categorize the restrictions or challenges that we confront as journalists and editors as belonging to three domains. There's the legal, there's the what I would call the economic/business related restrictions, and the third, which in many ways is quite troubling because it's not as if we have easy answers to it, are the pressures that are coming in from the public, from civil society. And each of these three in their own way are acting, the legal, the economic and business pressures and pressures from civil society are operating to circumscribe, to limit what reporters can write about, what television channels can cover. So legal, I don't need to tell you of the kind of laws which exist in our country to deal with reporting post facto. So yes, there is no pre-censorship to which I have to subject my journalism. But if I carry an article on the website that I edit, for example, The Wire, then I am subject to the laws of civil and criminal defamation, contempt of court if applicable, if governments choose to, they can invoke 153 hate speech laws, 295. There's a full range of provisions within the Indian Penal Code that governments which want to use or misuse the law can easily invoke in order to put pressure. And these are not academic, these are not simply possibilities. All of us who have been working journalists have examples of this. I was editor of The Hindu in Chennai for 3 years, and in those 3 years I collected 3 criminal defamation cases filed against me personally as editor of The Hindu by the Chief Minister of the state for ridiculous crimes on my part. One of them was to report a press conference by Mr. Karunanidhi as leader of the opposition, where he referred to Jayalalitha as an inefficient chief minister. So she filed a criminal defamation case against the opposition leader and against the editor of The Hindu, even though that story was reported in every paper. But because Hindu was a large paper and she was surprised, why is the Hindu taking this? So of course I got a stay order. But that case lingers, and 10 years from now, rest assured, I will get an urgent summons from somebody in Chennai saying, "Sir, your presence is required, sir." And if I don't turn up, you then live in fear of Tamil Nadu police coming with a non-bailable warrant. So the fear of confronting these kinds of malicious prosecutions. And even though we have lots of examples, even recently the Supreme Court pulled up the Tamil Nadu government, oral observations, that you cannot misuse criminal defamation like this. But the court, having upheld the law of criminal defamation, in full knowledge of how this law is used, is a fine one to talk today, because this remains now as a sword of Damocles over every journalist. And there are states where this is regularly invoked, Tamil Nadu being one, West Bengal. How many of you know that Professor Ashish Nandi had to apologize for writing a harmless op-ed in the Times of India, Kingshuk Nag's paper, where he made politically uncharitable comments about the Gujarati middle class and the BJP and Mr. Narendra Modi. And he was subject to a sedition charge, a defamation charge, all kinds of charges leveled against him. And simply in order to get the monkey off his back, this professor, who was close to 80, decided that it was easier for him to simply accept the Supreme Court's request that he apologize and have the case dismissed. So these are legal pressures that we do confront. Our chairperson mentioned hate speech and non-state actors. I can tell you that in this country, hate speech laws such as they exist are never applied against those who actually engage in hate speech. They are, if at all, applied against people who engage in legitimate criticism. And again, there are lots of examples of this. When I was a reporter at the Times of India, and I did a story on how this is during the Vajpayee government, how the Bajrang Dal were attacking Christians in Mathura and Agra. And I quoted on the record the leader of the Bajrang Dal in Mathura as saying, our goal is to drive all Christians out of Uttar Pradesh. And I got a legal notice from the National Commission on Minorities as to why I should not be prosecuted under 153A. No notice went to the Bajrang Dal fellow. But the act of reporting and making society conscious of what kind of politicians exist put me under threat. So that's the way in which the law operates. Economic. I mentioned the economic pressures. Well, this is pretty obvious. Given the kind of business model which underpins the Indian media today, proprietors are extremely risk averse. They would much rather not do a story which would rub the government the wrong way. The government may be a state government, may be a powerful official in the city, could be the Prime Minister, could be the leader of the ruling party. But increasingly proprietors do not want to touch adversarial stories because they realize that the government still has enormous power either to turn on or off the advertising tap, or to use investigating agencies, open up a tax investigation, unleash the enforcement directorate. And these are not, as I said, imaginary fears. We have examples of this happening in the past. Today, of course, many proprietors subsidize their media operations through other businesses that they run. Some of them use or misuse their media arms in order to lobby for those other industries. But either way, the fact is that they are vulnerable to all kinds of pressures, and I would say this is the single most common form in which the pressure not to report something occurs in the Indian media, where the proprietor is simply worried about how the government would react to a certain story, leans on his or her editor, leans on reporters to make sure that a certain story does not get covered. And again, if there's time in the discussion, I can give you examples of this. But it's the third. I would say connected to the economic and the legal side is increasing tendency for some of India's largest corporations to use the threat of punitive legal action and huge lawsuits to ensure that there is no negative coverage of their business activities in the press. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Paranjoy Guha Thakurta, who is now the editor of Economic and Political Weekly. But the book that he wrote on KG Basin, the KG Basin scandal or scam, if you want to call it, where he accused, on the basis of documents, Reliance Industries of gold plating the project in order to over-invoice from the government and thereby deny the government a rightful share of its royalties. Massive lawsuits threatened against him, the publishers, the poor young woman who sent out media invitations to attend the book launch got a 100 crore lawsuit notice. So these are the kinds of methods that are used by some of India's most powerful corporations to ensure that whatever coverage comes in the media about them is benign and harmless. But it's the last point that I want to spend a minute on and in a way connect the dots to the issue on which I began, which is that of Mr. Arnab Goswami, which is that, fine, we may be able to, by being legally cautious, prudent, we can deal with the threat of criminal defamation, contempt of court, and various other legal challenges that we might have to confront. As long as we stay aloof from or are not overly dependent on government ads, and as long as we don't have other collateral business interests that the government can use as a lever to squeeze you, we need not worry too much about the economic or the business side exerting a negative impact on media coverage. But what do you do in a situation where the dominant media in this country are pushing public opinion in the direction of greater and greater intolerance, irrationality, I would say superstition, because a lot of media houses do this kind of thing, but essentially pushing public opinion in the direction of regarding criticism of the government, dissent as something which is treacherous, anti-national, pro-terrorist, pro-Pakistan, whatever label you want to fix on it. And this is the situation where we are in today. It used to be that media was adversarial towards the government and took great pride in going after those who are in authority. Today the media, or the dominant strand, takes great pride in being adversarial towards those who are against the government. You could have a situation where on Times Now, a Greenpeace activist who was illegally prevented from flying out of the country and who subsequently won her case in the Delhi High Court, with the High Court passing serious strictures against the government for having acted in an undemocratic manner. Any journalist who knows basic law in this country would not have been in any doubt about where the truth and justice in this matter lay. Yet, on the same channel, Times Now, this patently illegal act of the government of India in preventing a citizen from flying out of the country is defended as if this is the greatest act of patriotism, and the activists or all those who try to speak in her interest or speak in her favor are run down as agents of the British. And even though this Greenpeace woman is trying to say that we were going to testify against Vedanta, which is a British company, so by preventing us from growing, you're actually batting for the British. There's no room for any discussion or debate. Of course, when the High Court criticized the government and vindicated the position of this activist, there was no discussion on that channel. The mustachioed general, who was frothing at the mouth, was quite silent and did not feel that he had to comment when the story went in a different direction. Unfortunately, today, what we are seeing is a race to the bottom on part of many of these channels. And when the right wing competes with the right wing, when irrationality competes with irrationality, you see a complete plummeting of standards, ethical, professional, moral. And you can end up in a situation where people who are completely ignorant of law can, as journalists, stand up and demand legal action against other journalists. So here you have a situation where the media itself, since we're talking about censorship and freedom of expression, the media itself, or the dominant section of the media, is demanding restrictions on itself. And because this channel has the highest viewership, the public is applauding this. Now I can deal with legal pressure, I can deal with business pressure. How do I deal with pressure that comes manufactured, whatever way you want to describe it, pressure that comes from civil society, from ordinary people that say, yes, all you journalists are crooks, all you journalists are anti-national, there should be restrictions on you. And this I find the most worrying, that a culture, an atmosphere has been created where politicians who anyway dislike the media speaking the truth are managing to mobilize public opinion in favor of restrictions. And this I find is a battle that's going to be the hardest to fight. Of course, we will fight it. But this can't be fought if within the media you have significant sections who want greater restrictions, who want greater censorship, who want the law to be used against the messenger. Thank you.
Can I please request everybody to please switch off their phones because it interferes with the mics? May I now invite Mr. Kingshuk Nag to speak to us? He said he wouldn't mind going there.
There are two phones here. I can speak while standing also. Actually, after Siddharth has delivered such a good speech, there's nothing much more for me to say. I agree with most of the things he said. Today officially there is no censorship. When we think of censorship, we think of the days of the emergency when papers would come out with blank pages because it showed the attitude of the paper that we are not going to submit ourselves to censorship. There is no censorship in that sense today. But when you look at, and I'm not looking at television, suppose you look at some major newspapers coming from Delhi, reporting on major events, what you get is one version, same version of one event. I often wonder, why is it so? There are so many papers, why everybody is writing about the same event in the same way? Is there some big hand there in Delhi from whose hand people are getting fed? So they write the same story? I suspect something of that sort is happening. That's the worst kind of censorship. Actually, without having a censor, you are having somebody, and I'll ask Siddharth to elaborate on it later, who is actually feeding all the story. So something happens, the same events are being covered in the same way with the same perspective. Let me not dilate on that. I'll talk about the areas in which I operate. We are in the state of Telangana. Telangana became a state 2 years ago. People are very happy because it was a movement for regional identity. And the locals were happy that they had got their own state. We had also supported the Telangana movement. Within a few days of the Telangana becoming a reality, I got a letter from the Chief Secretary of the state of Telangana. Then I realized not only me but many other editors had also got it. What was the letter? The letter said, never describe Telangana as T in your headlines. Always refer to as TS. I wondered why. No, we have decided that TS is the short form of Telangana. I said, but in Gujarat we don't write GS. In Karnataka we don't write KS. In West Bengal we don't write WBS. Why in Telangana we should write TS? So informally they told us that is the desire of the Chief Minister. So the most funny thing is that all newspapers fell in line except mine. All newspapers without asking a question fell in line. They didn't ask why you are asking us to describe Telangana state as TS in short form. They said yes sir. So I did not fall in line. After a few days a delegation came to see me. There was few MPs in the delegation of the ruling party and there was the Director of Information and some other guys. They said, sir, we are very upset with your anti-Telangana reportage. But I said, why are you upset? I thought I was the only editor who supported the Telangana movement. No sir, but your reportage is becoming very anti-Telangana now. So I investigated. Then I came to know that they are basically saying that Chief Minister Garu is very upset that you are describing Telangana as T and not as TS. Well, let me say the end of the story that I have still not changed my line and they have given up for the time being. This is the point. This is the sort of censorship, this is the sort of uni-view that the governments of the day do. And for doing this, they can take recourse to anything. In this state itself, as you know, the government is soon going to bring out a paper which will be called Telangana Today. That paper will hit the stand in another month. What is the avowed objective? The avowed objective is that the monopoly over news, which is held by English papers like Times of India and Hindu, of course to say Hindu is not correct, has to be disturbed, and Telangana Today will give the version of the people of the state. In other words, this is a form of censorship. Since when has it become the business of the government to start a newspaper? Number two, who is financing the newspaper? Who is going to sell the newspaper? How are you going to sell the newspaper? What are you going to print in that? So today we don't have formal ways of censorship, but we have got informal ways of censorship. And as editor of Times of India, I also know what happens to editors in other places. The first thing they do is to close the tap. A newspaper which comes to you at a price of ₹4 actually costs us to ₹25 to produce. So somebody is subsidizing the paper. Who is subsidizing the paper? The advertiser is. And the advertisers are the corporate type and advertiser of the government type. So state government thinks, okay, we'll close the tap. So the moment the state government threatens to close the tap on advertisement, your own advertising people will come to you, sir, we are very upset, sir, what are you writing, sir? Kuch kijiye, sir, samaliye, sir. In Chandigarh, our editor was writing about the drug cartel of Punjab, which of course came to the fore later through Urta Punjab. And immediately the tap was closed. And man who was closing the tap was one of the main culprits in the whole thing, some Magithia. Later he was even raided by the Enforcement Directorate. The same thing happens in West Bengal. The same thing happens in Tamil Nadu. So this is a new form of censorship. I stop the advertising. And not only do government stop advertising, private sector also stops. Mr. Tata is very upset with one story in Times of Economic Times, so he closes the tap. Mr. Mukesh Ambani is very upset, so he closes the tap. So this is the new form of censorship that you have today. And a newspaper is not led by an editor in that sense. There are so many departments. And then all the other departments will gang up against the editor. You are not understanding. So this is the sort of environment you have to operate in. But as Siddharth said, the worst scenario is when your own reader, when your own viewers turn against you. That is what happens. That is also something which I have seen very closely while I was the editor of Times of India in Gujarat during the Gujarat riots. It was very clear to us the riots were not good. People were being killed. People of one denomination were being killed. So you have to stand up for it. But the moment you stand up, your own leaders start complaining about your paper. साहब आपका पेपर ऐसा हो गया, साहब आपका पेपर ऐसा प्रो हो गया, खाली इनके बारे में लिखते हैं. Then you start getting hate mails through postcards, through telephone calls, through visitors. Then I remember one VAP Vardi, Mr. Tovadia came to me and threatened me. अगर आप ऐसे लिखेंगे तो we will ensure that you are socially boycotted. Not only you are socially boycotted, but your wife is also socially boycotted. No shop will sell any good to her. No servant will work in your house. So in such circumstances, what do? Then your own office staff was turned against you, other department people. Well, when I was in Gujarat as the editor, there was a formal complaint against me to the management from within the company. Please investigate this guy about his writing and how he's running the paper. Of course, thankfully, I did not know about the inquiry and I was also exonerated after the inquiry. But the worst kind of censorship you have to take up with. When you know the government is actually formally censoring you, you know what the enemy you are up against. But in most cases, you don't even know what the enemy is up against you are. Most of the time, you are fighting. What are you fighting? You don't know. My maternal great-grandfather used to run a newspaper in the British Times. And once, it was a Bengali paper, and in that paper once he reported that some Irish soldiers have raped some Indian women. So they filed a sedition case against him. And he was asked to retract and apologize, which he refused to. Then what happened was immediately a huge punitive fine was levied on the paper. It was so large that the paper more or less closed down. It never closed down, it ran for a few, 1 or 2 decades, and the financial base of the paper was destroyed. So which newspaper proprietor today will take such a stand? Nobody will, especially because today bringing out a newspaper is not the main business of the newspapers. It is a side appendage of businessmen. This whole process has also, we should not look at this process without looking at the process of politics. Unfortunately, in this process of last 25 years since we have this liberalization process, politics has become contractorized, what I call. You require more and more money for running in politics, and only contractors are in the business of being MPs. Look at the list of MPs and you will find so many people who are just plain businessmen, especially from this and the neighboring state. In the good old days, G.T. Birla would become a MP when he is thinking of retiring, taking it as a cap on his feather before his retirement. But today, businessmen think, अरे हमारे पैसे से ये politician बनता ना, so why should I not become a politician myself? So today, there are so many ministers, MPs, MLAs who are actually businessmen and contractors who have become politicians. And when you become politicians, you become minister, what do you want to do? You want to further your business interests. And what comes in your way? Public opinion. If public opinion does not come into your way, you can use up land here, there, everywhere, and build huge so-called capital cities. In the neighboring state, Andhra Pradesh, there will be a new capital. It will be built on the river banks. And now, still on the river banks, the Chief Minister wants to build iconic towers of 31 floors each. Hey Baba, how can you build 31 floors on the river front? Oh, but that is the model. We'll sell that 31 floor model, and then land prices will be jacked up. When land prices will be jacked up, I'll make more money out of speculation. When I make more money out of speculation, I'll myself make more profits, and I'll plow that into politics. And once I'm again re-elected, I'll make more money. So this is the model you have. So the whole problem of censorship and the whole problem of curbing the press is linked with the process of how politics is moving. So today, if you want to restructure the press, the laws of the press, how the press operates, don't look at anything, look at how you reform the political system. Because if you know how to reform your political system, and if you have reformed your political system, the economy will be reformed, and so will the press and the media. I think I have to say this much only at this point. I can elaborate on this for hours and hours together, but I will not take much more of your time. Thank you.
Can I request Deepta to...
Hello everyone. Thank you very much for being so patient and waiting to attend the panels. Thank you again for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to come back to law school so soon after graduating. Let's start off with something that's quite similar between the press and our trial narratives. And that's simply the structure in which the courts and the press operate these days. You have burning fire on screen when Times Now is airing. You have a journalist sitting in judgment. You have a panel of victims out for slaughter. And you have a battle raging forth. And at the end of the day, you have viewers who are going to decide whose side they're on. And literally, the trial, the adversarial system of justice that we have right now, looks very similar. You have a judge, you have two lawyers out baying for blood, and you have one side trying to win over the other using any means possible. Now, the problem with the media, at least visual media, playing into and cashing on this form that we're so used to being fed very well was thrown light on by our other panelists. But it does, at a very basic level, create a fundamental rift between the information that you're being fed, the form in which it's being given to you, and the knowledge you're supposed to draw from it. So when you talk about the freedom of the press, you also have a huge rift between what sort of information the press is giving you and the form in which it gives it to you. So the entire JNU debacle that was played forth between us, you saw a complete breakdown not just of law and justice, but of the role of the media itself, wherein the media sits in trial, passes a judgment, and then you have a supposedly rational, objective arbiter in the form of a magistrate trying to make sense of a scene that he's already been fed information on. But leaving visual media aside and leaving aside the question of freedom of the press, you also have certain instances wherein the media becomes slightly more problematic than the censorship of the media is. And let me give you a classic example. I'm sure you guys are familiar with Spicy IP, right? Shamnath Bashir's blog, it's run mostly by students from NUJS. People contribute very often. You also would have been familiar that a few years ago, I'm sure, did you contribute by any chance? Oh. Good job. So a few years ago, the Financial Times and Bennett Coleman were engaged in a heated trademark battle. And a 22-year-old NUJS student wrote a review on the trademark angle of this particular case that was raging on. And incidentally, she was served a legal notice along with Spicy IP from none other than Bennett Coleman, which incidentally runs Times of India as well. So you have here a situation which is quite hilarious, wherein you have the journalists and the press crying out very rightfully for fewer restrictions on the freedom of speech. You have a very, very big problem when it comes to censorship of the press. No one's discounting that or even disputing it. But what do you do in a situation when your champions of free speech become the censors of free speech themselves? And what does it mean for individuals who denounce criminal restrictions on free speech, criminal censorship, either through hate speech, defamation, obscenity, which interestingly nobody has really touched upon because Section 292 is also an extremely effective and quite an insidious form of censorship, right? What do you do in this situation, and where do you call upon the media to take a step back and possibly reflect on what repercussions this is going to have for the debate on free speech, right? Speaking of the law and how it should react and respond and evolve to current trends on free speech, you have quite a dire situation on your hands. You have on one hand reasonable restrictions being the norm as per the Constitution of India, which is thrown at you every now and then whenever you seek to dissent. You have a large list of criminal restrictions, many of which were listed out right now. And if you look at the history of censorship, you would see that different forms of restriction would come into vogue at different points of time. So the turn of the decade, obscenity was all the rage. You had M.F. Hussain, you had Wendy Doniger, you had cartoonists, you had Amit Trivedi's cartoons coming under fire. And suddenly you see, as the political climate slowly changes, you find contempt of court replacing obscenity. And now you see a whole lot of communalism being reported, therefore hate speech coming up. You see sedition taking center stage. And as time goes by, you see individual challenges to individual criminal provisions, calling them excessive restraints. Now, the problem with this is simply that you cannot call for a complete drawback or withdrawal of censorship without tackling the entire essence of criminal restraints. It becomes extremely difficult for you to challenge a Section 499 and 500 and then come back, regroup, and challenge Section 292. So unless you have some sort of concerted effort to look at the entire criminal penal provisions restricting free speech, it becomes extremely difficult for us to reinvent the wheel whenever situations of this nature keep cropping up. And believe you me, they will continue to repeat themselves. Speaking also of pressures of civil society, and that being a mode of censorship, I would like to draw your attention to a very recent publication by Zuban. It's called Do You Remember Kunan Pushpora? And I'm sure Gautam will be able to elaborate a lot more on the situation in Kashmir. So Kunan Pushpora are twin villages in the border district of Kupwara in Kashmir. In 1991-92, there was a mass rape reported in both these villages. And the process of the judiciary was so far compromised. The state actors, non-state actors involved in investigating these crimes were so horribly, horribly biased. And state impunity reigned supreme actually in this time. So only recently has this case begun reinvestigation. So the point of the matter is that Mr. B.G. Varghese from the Press Council of India was actually sent to Kunan and Pushpora to conduct a separate independent investigation to find out what the facts were. And through this publication, Do You Remember Kunan Pushpora, it was proven that this individual had never visited those villages. But the press was still used as a method to put a mark of approval on the stand of the state. So you have here this interesting love-hate relationship between the state on one hand and the media on the other, wherein the media becomes an extremely effective and convenient tool of, supporting state action in one hand, and on the other becomes a very big problem when it questions the state. So the problem here is how do you use the law in such situations, or how can you expect the law to really intervene and regulate such situations? Finally, it really does boil down to a question of what the media really looks like these days. We did touch upon Jayalalitha's case right now, defamation. Incidentally, I don't know if you guys know, Jayalalitha has been directed to furnish a list of all the defamation cases she's filed in the recent past in the next hearing on August 21st. So that's probably going to shed some light on how much she loves this particular provision. But you really do see censorship not just playing out against the media and journalists and spreading forth the chilling effect, but you also find that within the Supreme Court, there is fairly divided opinion on the use of criminal defamation. For instance, Justice Nariman, who passed the Shreya Singhal judgment, is on this particular bench along with Deepak Mishra, who incidentally struck down the challenge to Section 499. And now you have an interesting sort of balance coming out wherein the court affirms that they do stand by their opinion of not wanting to take away Section 499, but reinforcing the fact that you cannot use criminal defamation as a method of curbing political dissent. And that really leads us to the question of what dissent looks like. And what is the role of the dissenter, and what is the role of the conscientious objector within the media itself? Because I believe that the time or the call right now is really for more conscientious objectors within the media to stand up and possibly take a stand in dissent. Just another stray thought in response to the economic constraints on the media. Now, I know that advertising remains one of the most necessary sources of revenue for the media, but I have on my hands a client who requires notice to be sent. Now, what do you do when you can't serve notice through court or RPAD? You go for substituted service, right? How do you serve a notice through substituted service? You try paper publication. And how much does this paper publication cost? Now, the cheapest one that we could get was 5,780 rupees. And this is a client, incidentally, who does not have the money to put her daughter into 11th and 12th standard. She doesn't have the money to pay that fees. So the question that I would really like to ask is, how do you differentiate between making money through advertising revenues and choosing who you charge how much? Because there is a lot of necessity for a lot more conscientious lawyering, no doubt, but also a little more support from the media whom we as lawyers constantly come into interaction with in our day-to-day court processes. So with that, thank you very much, and I hope to have a rather engaging discussion.
Can I now invite Mr. Gautam Navlakha to address the gathering?
Thank you, friends, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share some of my views. Siddharth, Kingshuk and Deepa have already covered a lot of ground, which leaves me free to wander into other areas. I'm not just going to confine myself to Kashmir, because what interests me where the question of censorship and freedom of the press is concerned is, as both Siddharth and Kingshuk have said, there is no legal censorship here in the country, although various laws can be used. Thank you. Can be used to actually, debilitate a journalist, a reporter, a newspaper, a channel or whatever from reporting whatever they are doing or carrying stories or follow-up stories, etc. I want to look at this problem from a slightly different vantage point, that is coming as a civil liberties activist. Obviously, we are confronted with this issue in many different ways. What interests me is that why is it, let's take concrete examples. Why is it that in Bastar, when the journalists were under attack, the newspapers for whom they were working as stringers virtually disowned them and refused to come to their aid? So now you have a situation in Bastar you had where the state was attacking the reporters from working in the most inhospitable circumstances possible and reporting, and in fact carrying out the job far more professionally and with a degree of integrity which you rarely see even in the national media. These are the small reporters and stringers who also act as distributors and collectors of small advertisements for the newspapers in order to be counted as a stringer. So there are a lot of pressures under which they work. Yet they are the ones who go and cover a war zone and bring out the reality, the cruel realities of the war, highlight some aspects of it, and they get into trouble. When they get into trouble, the newspapers withdraw their support. Because why? A lot of problem with the Indian media is that the owners of the media themselves have multiple interests. Not everybody is like Bennett Coleman, which has only interest in media. And now, of course, they want to branch out. A lot of them have interest in mining, in industry, etc. This is true of Chhattisgarh, Bastar, Madhya Pradesh, Odisha, you name it. All the major newspaper chains, Hindi and not just the English, have some interest or the other in mining, manufacturing and others. Now, how do you expect the same corporations and the same media that they own to report truthfully? Why would they? So while we may not have censorship, we have another kind of censorship that operates, which operates within because the corporates have their interest to guard. That makes it possible for reporters working in the most abominable conditions possible in war zones to become prey and see that nobody comes to their aid. And they would have been forgotten but for the fact that some of the people who were affected were people like us. And media took note of it. Had they been just small-time reporters confined to Bastar, nobody would have probably even noticed what was happening. So it's just a chance that this story about what was happening in Bastar came to us. People became alert, and then after that, the kind of reporting you have seen has markedly improved, but the reporting from the ground has more or less disappeared. Kashmir. That's another, when since 1990 has the Indian media reported? There has been no direct censorship. There has been no direct censorship, yet they have carried the national security perspective very faithfully and loyally in the newspapers in strat-jacketing the discussion, debate, or even have a conversation, an open conversation. So if I were to come out and say that Kashmir is an occupied territory, that people have a right to demand referendum, surely I'm out. There is no way this view would get carried, even in the letters to the editor's column, in response to an article that is written. That's a different kind of censorship. It is a self-censorship that we, because of our love for nation state, which drives us to jingoism, we are willing to censor certain discussions, debate, and not allow it to go beyond a certain parameter that has been set. And that, unmindful of censorship, I mean, that there is no legal bar. Because the same things I have written in Economic and Political Weekly, and nobody dare stop me from doing that. But no national media would carry it. Now, I should be thankful for Small Mercies, as many others, that there are still places in India where you can get things written. So it's not a completely dark scenario. But the dominant narrative is something entirely different. And that's the dominant narrative that you're confronted with. I'm not so exercised by Arnab Goswami because he'll meet his comeuppance one of these days. So that's not my problem. But Arnab Goswami is become what he has become as a result of what has been happening in the Indian media for a long time. It's also been happening for a long time, because what do we mean by freedom of expression? And what does freedom of press mean in the context of the fundamental right that we have of freedom of expression, notwithstanding the reasonable prefix added to it? We can discuss what is reasonable or unreasonable. That's another subject matter. The point I'm trying to make is very simple, that if we really cherish freedom of expression, then freedom of expression is not just of the media. And media's responsibility is to report, is to convey, to inform, to provide information to wider public about what is happening on the real ground. If there is a policy, what is its impact? What is the opposition? What are the dissenters saying? Etc., etc., etc. I mean, Forest Right Act, for instance, what is happening to it? Why is it being made into why is it being turned into a mincemeat? Because it's being hollowed out in the actual manner in which it is being implemented. So reportage of what is happening on the ground, what people are saying, what challenges they are meeting, what opposition they are confronting, all these are important issues. How much of this gets reported? Mercifully, some of it does get filtered through, so it's not as if nobody reports. That's not the point. But the point is that the dominant narrative still is not informed by these concerns. And this becomes a major issue, because what is freedom of expression? Freedom of expression is not just your and mine, and in fact, we should be very mindful of the fact that in this country, whereas you may have our expression, and nobody could trample upon them or we could fight back, and we are not isolated and alone. Millions of Indians and their freedom of expression has been sacrificed, has been abridged, has been violated. And it happens every day. It's their freedom of expression that is my concern, not the freedom of expression of the Indian elite. They'll find their own ways of getting themselves heard. That's not a problem for me. If Arnab Goswami and Barkha Dutt is powerful enough to counter Arnab Goswami. It's not as if she is devoid of any support. But a post-Sod, an Adivasi who's in Bastar, fighting for his land, which is going to be taken over by a mining, either a public sector or a private sector corporation. What freedom of expression, his expression, or the collective expressions of people, because freedom of expression is not just of individual, it's also of groups, associations. Right to form association gives us the right also to express collectively our views. What is happening to that? In a country where we ban and proscribe political ideologies because people, the powers that be decide that certain organizations are terrorist, Simi. How often do we discuss the case of Simi? I've just given Siddharth copy of 2 reports that PUDR and a coordination of democratic rights organization have brought out for your library, and I hope some of you read it. Because what concerns me is not just the question of the kind of censorship or the problem of censorship that the media faces. As I said, media itself is responsible for censoring many, many views and many debates and discussions. So in Kashmir, you'll have people write comments, opinion pieces, that's it. But the kind of reportage that you require on Kashmir, because we need to be educated about it also. Has the media done that? Has the media informed us that the Kashmir is not just a problem of terrorism? That it's not a question of Pakistan? That this place has been under Indian control for last 69 years? We have 600,000 troops. Has the media informed us? Has the media informed us that the powers, even the constitutional freedoms that you and I enjoy in Hyderabad, Delhi, Bombay, Kolkata, are not freedoms that they can exercise in Kashmir or in Bastar or any other conflict zone that exists in this country? They don't. It doesn't bother us. It doesn't matter to us. Because what happens to Anab and Barkha, that becomes a bigger story than what is happening in Bastar, what is happening in Kashmir. So, there is a hierarchy and there is a list of priority that we create for ourselves where we place that certain issues are more important, others less important. Kashmir is a non-issue for a large number of people and opinion makers. There is no problem for many. Yet, we are caught by surprise every time Kashmir erupts. And we start asking ourselves and scratching our head, folks, what the hell is going wrong? Here were 90% or 70% of people who turned up for participating in elections, and we were told that everything is hunky-dory and people are coming out in hordes to vote. That means people have accepted to or reconciled themselves to be a part of India. So why are they rising in revolt again and again? Nobody tells us. It suits us to distort and demonize and to present the matter as that it's Pakistan behind the trouble, that it's a proxy war that we are facing, and our Indian soldiers are military, which is deployed against our own people, by the way. All that doesn't matter. That this doesn't create the conditions for people to feel dissatisfied, disenchanted, alienated, antagonistic. Do not believe that they have a future for themselves if they continue to be part of India. Why is it so difficult for us to do that? So my worry is not press, newspapers some will collapse, new ones will rise. We know that. Some will be taken over, big media will take over small media. If it becomes more important for them to do it, as Ambanis have done as far as the electronic channels are concerned. In almost 4 of the major electronic channels, they have invested heavily. So how do you expect these media houses to be so committed to their to freedom of the press that they would write anything where Ambanis would get targeted? And there are many reasons for them to be. And there are serious issues that doesn't get, that doesn't get to us. So there are problems therefore, with the way in which we self-censor. Some amount of censorship is good. We do it ourselves. I'm very angry in my heart thinking, I have a pathological hatred of RSS. Now, if I give vent to it, I'm not going to make much sense to anyone. So I censor my thoughts. I moderate. I tone it down. I try to put it in terms of reasons and arguments and things like that. One has to try and struggle hard when one is, caught up with this pathological hatred one has. The point I'm trying to make is that there is some amount of restraint we practice because we value freedom. Because we value freedom. Because we want to get across. We want to start a dialogue, a discussion, a debate, to reach out, to make people feel, to provoke them or to encourage them into rethinking, looking at things afresh, in another way of looking at it. Now, if we can't do that,